Okay, so we might as well start with this huge crowd we have today. And the topic is exporting the Alaska model, which might not mean much to anyone if I don't explain it. I'm Gary Flomenhoft from the Gun Institute, and we have with us today Alanna Hartzok from the Earth Rights Institute. Alanna and I both contributed chapters to a book about the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend, which is the topic today, and Christopher Pearson is a Progressive Party representative to the State Assembly in Vermont. Believe it or not, Vermont is one of the few states that has a viable third party, of which Chris is a member. So let's get started, and I'll explain the Alaska model, and then what it is, and then Alanna is going to provide the pros and cons, some critique, and I'll explain how the model might be applied in Vermont, and then Chris will talk about the legislation that has been introduced twice for a Vermont Common Assets Trust Fund. So what is the Alaska model? The authors of the book about it is resource-based revenue is collected from a resource such as oil in the case of Alaska. It's placed into a sovereign wealth fund or other permanent endowment, and returns are paid directly in cash to citizens or residents, and that's what they call the permanent fund dividend in Alaska. And what is a sovereign wealth fund? Well, there are about 70 or 80 sovereign wealth funds around the world, many of them from oil, but also from non-commodity sources or other types of commodities such as diamonds, minerals, copper, or even, in the case of some Pacific islands, phosphates. And these royalties, severance taxes, fees are collected, they're placed into a trust fund, and the money is invested and used for government purposes, or in the case of Alaska, part of it is used to pay dividends. Now what's so unusual about Alaska, it's the only sovereign wealth fund in the world paying dividends to its citizens, which is kind of surprising considering there's 70 or 80 of them out there. Other types of dividends from state funds. Iran has a very interesting case where they eliminated all their fuel subsidies to try to go to a more market-based prices for energy, and as a result they were forced to pay compensation to the citizenry to compensate for the shock of higher prices. This is not from their oil fund, but it amounts to about $40 to $45 a month. There was an experiment by the Basic Income Earth Network of $10 a month to people in a region of Namibia, which was quite successful, but it was only temporary. And after the invasion of Iraq, this Alaska model was proposed by many people from both conservative and progressive sides as a model for Iraq, but it never got anywhere. It was proposed by Colin Powell, Jay Hammond, the former governor of Alaska, Eduardo Suplicy, one of the biggest advocates from Brazil, George Shultz, former Secretary of State, and many other prominent figures, but it never got anywhere. And in Vermont, we have twice introduced legislation for a common sovereign wealth fund for the state paying dividends, but has not passed yet. And then Mongolia just discovered oil, and they're talking about creating an Alaska-style fund. The distinction is that it's an unconditional fund paid to everyone. There are conditional payments in Brazil and Mexico under the Bolsa Familia and the Oportunidades programs. But those are conditional, those are means tested. A basic income or guaranteed income, the key issue is it's unconditional. And in my opinion, Alanna and I have been involved in this issue for a long time. The main objection, in my opinion, is the whole idea of Robin Hood, taking from one group, giving it to another. And the way to solve that problem is to base it on common assets, which are the common heritage of everybody. It's not produced by anybody's hard work, so you're not taking from one group, giving it to another group. You're just sharing what we all own. And in the 60s and 70s, when people actually cared about poverty, they proposed the idea of negative income tax, guaranteed income, and the conservative argument was this will be more efficient than having all these government programs. Just give it in cash, forget about means testing, get rid of that huge government bureaucracy. So that was the conservative argument. The sustainability argument, which concerns us at this conference, is what happens when the economy gets more efficient with automation and so forth? Jobs are eliminated. So the economy always has to create more and more jobs to employ people. So this is a growth trap. We can't get out of it with wage income. So we have to have a type of non-wage income to get out of the growth imperative of this, of the employment necessity of the current system. So it addresses the growth imperative by providing non-wage income. It promotes privacy. It eliminates big brother intrusiveness that's involved in means testing. And it also gives people freedom. They have freedom from forced labor and gives them more bargaining power. So these are some of the arguments for a guaranteed income. Okay, why base it on resources? Going back to Thomas Paine, he said there's two types of property. There is the earth and there is manufactured property, and they're completely different. You know, human beings did not create the earth, therefore everybody is entitled to an equal share. But manufactured property should belong to the person or people who created it. But therefore, he suggested creating a national fund out of rent paid for the use of land particularly, shared with everybody. So he originated the idea in his essay in 1797. So the source for the basic income is very important. It's a share of commonwealth rather than a redistribution of wealth. And people really object to the idea of Robin Hood. They don't want to give money to some freeloader that's not doing anything, but when you phrase it as sharing what we all own, that problem evaporates. And the proof of that is that it works in a conservative libertarian state of Alaska. It's wildly popular. It's not considered charity. It's considered a joint property right. There's no resentment. You're not taking from taxpayers, and you're not getting something for nothing. So it solves all of those problems with basic income. Now, getting to Alaska, here are some details on the way it works. Now, only about 11% of the oil revenue in Alaska goes into the permanent fund. The rest goes to fund government, which is why Alaska doesn't have any income or sales tax. 80% of their state revenue comes from oil and natural gas. But as you can see, only 11% goes into the permanent fund, and then they only use the earnings to pay dividends. All of the principal, the capital of the fund is retained. So they don't deplete the fund and they inflation-proof it. They only pay dividends from the earnings. And then looking at the little bit larger picture, you can see what percentage of the revenue did the state get and what percentage did the oil companies get. Well, as you can see, the oil companies got most of it. And that's because the royalties are about 12 to 15%. Compare that with Norway, where they get up to 78% of the rent on oil, and they have a much bigger fund. In fact, Norway has a $600 billion fund. So you can see that the royalties are quite low, but they still manage to fund the whole government. Here's the current value of the Alaska Fund. It's about $47 billion. It's invested in standard investments, in stocks, bonds, real estate, and so forth, using the prudent investor rule. And these are the dividends that have been paid. Every citizen of Alaska over the age of 1 gets a dividend check every year. It varies between $1,000 and $2,000 in recent times. And this is a form of weak sustainability, meaning they're substituting financial capital for the depletion of natural capital. So as the oil depletes, the fund will build up and they'll have an ongoing stream of revenue into the future. And that was the original purpose of the permanent fund, was to retain this wealth for future generations, not just to spend it all right now and not consider the future. So they wanted to retain some of the wealth of this oil bonanza that they got long into the future. So that was the permanent fund. The dividend came later with J. Hammond, who saw what happened in Bristol Bay when foreign fishing boats came in and just scooped up all the fish and the locals got left with nothing. And he saw the same thing happening with the oil companies coming in. He said, I want the people to get something from it, so he created this dividend. One of the unexpected consequences as a result of this guaranteed income that people in Alaska receive is that Alaska has the lowest or second lowest inequality of any state in the United States. In 2000, it was rated the lowest. In 2010, it was rated the second lowest in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, and up till 2000, it had the lowest increase in inequality in the United States. So, as everyone knows, inequality has vastly increased. I should update this to 2010. I'm sure it's even worse, as inequality has vastly increased. But Alaska has the least increase, and we argue it's due to this guaranteed income they get from oil. So that's a little introduction to the Alaska model, and next I would ask Alanna to provide her critique of the model.
I want to mention again that our presentations are published, and it's a two-book series on the Alaska Permanent Fund. There was very little information on the fund until these two books came out from Palgrave Macmillan, and they were put together as book anthologies by Carl Wiederquist and Michael Howard. So my particular focus is assessing the strengths and shortcomings of the fund. Having worked with colleagues in Nigeria and seeing the massive amount of oil wealth extracted from that country, and particularly the Bayelsa State in the Niger Delta, we used the Alaska Permanent Fund as a model to write permissive legislation and an idea for a Bayelsa State oil fund. So that was one of the reasons I had to review the Alaska Permanent Fund. So here we're going to look at the positive aspects of the fund, which should be obtained when we establish and propose new resource rent funds that distribute citizen dividends. So it is really the idea of the owner-state governance, and what this means is that read the quote here as contained in the Alaska Constitution: all the natural resources of Alaska belong to the state to be used, developed, and conserved for the maximum benefit of the people. So Alaska, being one of the two, of the other Hawaii, of our last states coming into the Union, has this rather innovative component of the Constitution that could be the basis for the fund. Participatory democracy. So it was established after a period of intense public debate and input, and in 1976 the voters approved the constitutional amendment. And there it is written down that the amendment is that at least 25% of all the mineral lease rentals, royalties, royalty sale proceeds, all these kinds of income coming into the state for the use of resources will be placed in a permanent fund, the principal of which shall be used only for those income-producing investments specifically designated by law as eligible for permanent fund investments. We're going to be talking about that second part of the Constitution later. That's a problematic part, but the good part is there was participatory democracy. We need to continue to participatory democracy for maybe reforming or modifying the fund the way it is. Transparency is so important everywhere, so there's a high degree of transparency regarding both administration and the investment details of the fund. The website, apfc.org, easily navigable, up to date. It educates the citizenry about the fund, and it permits questions. You can just type in your questions, and a staff person will respond individually to your concern. The simple requirement, as Gary mentioned, as the right requirement, well, it's 1 year old to be 1 year old, but also the residency is just 1 year. If you're resident in the state 1 year, you can receive the citizen dividend payment. So there's strong interest by citizens and support for the fund. The dividends do provide a significant amount of additional income for individuals and families. So as we said, it's been $1,000 to $2,000 a year. So a family of four, that's going to be $4,000 to $8,000 a year. Now, $8,000 a year was for a family, which it was some years. That is pretty significant for some families. Since the other 75% of Alaska's resource royalties fund a large portion of the state's budgetary requirements, Alaska has no need for personal income tax, further enhancing the financial capacities of the citizenry. This is an interesting point because often people, especially that rely on high income taxes in Europe, they say the payment of income taxes keeps the citizenry invested in the functioning of government. But we're saying here that the fact that the citizenry receives a check from their government is another way to keep the citizens very actively concerned about their governance. Alaska has an enabling postal banking and information technology infrastructure. This we take for granted. But when we're looking at it for Nigeria and these other developing, so-called developing countries, they don't have that. People don't have addresses. They navigate around by saying you go to this corner where this person lives and there's this store and then you walk through. You know, they don't have often addresses. Some of them don't have adequate banking systems. So this kind of infrastructure that allows a dividend to be tracked by address, by person, and then the check put in the mail and paid.
It's actually direct deposit to your bank account.
Well, sometimes they're now being able to use telephones. So there's much telephones throughout Africa and the other developing countries. They're doing banking transactions through telephones now. So I think that's in the way of being solved, that problem, but it certainly has been preventing the implementation of it elsewhere. All of these features should be replicated when establishing new resource rent-based dividend funds. The only exception is that the decision to allocate at least 25% of resource royalties and rents is specific to the APF. Why 25%? Why not 30? Why not? That's an arbitrary pick of a number of a percentage. That should be looked at individually. So the room for improvement, broadened citizen input. Decisions regarding the exact percentage of how much revenue should be placed in the permanent fund, investment fund, versus how much is to be used to finance state budgetary needs, I think should be made on a case-by-case basis. There shouldn't be a set formula, but with broad citizen input, that decision can best be made. Additionally, rather than fixing the percentage thereafter, as it did with the fund and the Constitution, it should be reviewed periodically. Use people's budget process. There should be citizen input determining those government budgetary needs as well. We now have working examples of this in the growing people's budget movements in Brazil and elsewhere, whereby citizens vote for line items of up to 50% or more of their city's budget. That is another way to engage people in their local governance, get the real power of voting how their tax dollars are directed to what purposes. Get the devil out of the details. A best practice model for future funds would be to monitor and inform regarding the exact mechanisms and formulas used for determining the amount of resource rent being collected. This methodology should also be reviewed and revised on a periodic basis. That's what I mean, devil in the details. Exactly how do you come up with how much a company should be paying a government for resource rights, for resource extraction? There has to be a very clear and transparent formula, because in most cases, there's actually much more profit that the company's making that we would call unearned income or surplus value that should be returned as a commons rents back to the people as a whole. And then the people get to decide whether they want government to finance public goods or whether they want a stronger, bigger citizen dividend. And that can be made, again, on a case-by-case basis, according to people's will. It should not be legislated and permanently set. So build out holistic models. Since the establishment of the Alaska Permanent Fund more than 30 years ago, there have been conceptual breakthroughs regarding how this type of fund fits in with what we could call a holistic, integrated green tax shift paradigm of public finance. Examples include models of the Northwest Environment Watch, now called Sightline Institute, and more recently the work Gary's done with the Vermont Green Tax and Common Assets Project, which she'll be talking about. So we want to include all commons rent domains in these models. Now the Alaska Fund is just oil, but there's many other commons rent domains. And they're always going to run out sooner or later, we all agree. But there may be other commons domains that will bring even more of the commons rent to the people. Those leading movements to establish future resource rent funds should familiarize themselves with these holistic and integrated approaches in order to bring to the fore the new economics paradigm for public finance policy. Once the blueprint is in place conceptually, the details for implementation can be fleshed out step by step and stage by stage, depending on what's politically feasible. So you have the whole map. And then just like if you're building a house, maybe you can only afford to build a couple of rooms and then you're going to build another room when you have the money. Some people build like step by step these days. But we can do the same thing with these models. Get the full, complete model conceptually and then work politically. I think that's happening also in Vermont. includes surface land rent. Now what is that? There is a surplus value or unearned income that attaches to surface land. And we have to conclude that even in our visualization of what is the commons. The commons is also the land value, the resource rents. So people who live in cities, they ask, what are the commons here? Well, what is the commons? But they're not yet seeing that the surface land that they live and work on is rightfully a commons. It's a privatized ownership, but the value, the land value that attaches is created by society as a whole, so it is a commons. So the surface land rent should be included in the models. It's a significant, likely to be a significant source of funds that could be shared by the people of Alaska, especially when the oil runs dry. The terms land value taxation, land value capture, and the term I used in April at the World Bank Land and Poverty Conference. Imagine economists at IMF, World Bank now talking about socializing something, and they are. So my paper title was Socializing Land Rent and Untaxing Production. That came from Dr. Paul Collier. He's the IMF World Bank advisor on Africa as an Oxford professor. And when I first heard him speak the previous year strongly about the need to socialize land rent, I never thought I would hear that kind of conversation by a keynote speaker and advisor to the World Bank. So anywhere I think there's sincere people looking for new economics, many of them are starting to see this perspective. So that refers to the public charge of a fee for use of surface land in lieu of, in place of, the now kind of property taxes we have that falls more so on homes and buildings, and then to remove the wage income tax and remove the good things, the production of wealth through goods and services. So not only is the potential public revenue from surface land rent significant as an amount, the incentive effects are impressive. For example, when surface land rent, now we're talking about a property tax, but a different form of property tax that's land value based only. And we're saying the land value is a commons, it's created by society as a whole. That's what we're driving at here. It's not a totally new form of taxation, it's a reworking of a property tax to make it work for all these benefits you're going to see. So land is freed from socially harmful incentives for profiteering and land speculation, and thus maintains affordability. With affordable land, you're going to have affordable housing. If you're going to untax wages and production, there's going to be more of the economy that can get to work building the affordable housing that we need. Affordable land means more people can access land upon which to labor. For homes and businesses, growing food and securing energy from solar, wind, and wood, they still require land, solar, wind, and wood. When land costs are lowered and remain stable instead of the boom-bust cycles, more funding is then free for capitalization of, let's focus it on, local businesses. Property tax has been a local tax, still is. Let's make it work for building the local-based economy. Whether they be cooperatives, community corporations, or individual or family-owned businesses, they need finance. We want that kind of economics to grow, I think many of us, while the old system fades away. More benefits of surface land rent capture, all that land value taxation. Lower land costs mean lower mortgage payments as well. You know, if land prices keep going faster than wages, which they typically do, people have to work longer and harder for a basic necessity of housing, and have to borrow more from the bank. So lower land cost means lower mortgage payments. Land rent is a substantial sum that can pay for education, healthcare, and other public infrastructure. Urban land sites are better utilized. Sprawl is curtailed because this public finance approach encourages infill development. Instead of plotches of land that's being just sitting there, maybe boarded up buildings, they're just speculating on that, they're counting on somehow the community fixing up the land or some kind of government subsidy coming into the city that's going to then increase their land value, and then maybe they'll release their land for others to access it. This land value tax policy drives the development in towards the city where we need. And if you have a more intensive development in the city rather than the sprawl, you have walkable cities, You have better use of public transport. It doesn't have to go so far out. The whole utilities and everything can be much more efficiently used when you have more compact, livable cities. And this is certainly a policy that will harness the cities in that direction. So now a couple of the previous models, one in particular, let's say first World Watch Institute, David Rudman's book on natural wealth of nations, did the first very crude model of a tax shift, just looking at global taxation. And just a modest pie diagram that showed the shift off of productive capital and income wages and onto the resource rents. And then Sightland Institute that came out of World Watch, Alan Durney and Ura Bauman did a model based on the Pacific Northwest. Now that would be Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. Can you see those on the screen? I'll read through a little bit. The next one I'm going to show on the right is going to be bigger in the next slide. But the one on the left, that showed their current tax pie. Now the largest, almost half, was taxes on business income and sales at 48%. There's a little pink section called miscellaneous. They had a significant amount of existing environmental taxes at 18%. And then the light blue quarter is property taxes, the regular kind of property tax, falling mostly on the homes and buildings at 27%. So now the next slide really shows what they came up with as a model to go towards. And you'll notice the business and income, the sales tax pie, piece of that pie is significantly lower, down to 16%, replaced with pollution and carbon taxes, traffic taxes, hydropower taxes, water, timber, fish, and minerals taxes. Now these are the Pigouvian green taxes. These are the additional commons rent taxes and fees for the use of common heritage resources. And that half of the diagram kept the existing environmental taxes and miscellaneous, but in the quarter that was light blue with the property taxes, in this model they shifted it completely in the correct direction, which is a land value only property tax of 27% in this model. This kind of modeling then, with the information and the data and the kind of envisioning that it gives us, can then readily and easily be utilized for lobbying and political building and movements for implementation. This diagram is from our Australian colleagues because better than the United States, in fact the United States no longer even records the land value and the surface land rent. It's not kept in the national statistics any longer, but Australia does. And we're going to spend some time on this slide because I think it's so important. First it goes from 1911 to 2007. I think we have one a little more recent than this too. And the blue is the net earned incomes of labor and capital. We're looking at the real economy, the productive economy in that blue section. So 85% in 1911. The pink is taxes expropriated from labor and capital. Taxes on labor and capital, nothing different about that, but it was just 6% in 1911. Now the gray is 8%, and that was the privatized, publicly created land rent. What this means is the land rent from the commons value of surface land and minerals, all the minerals, extractive resources of Australia. That private profit in 1911 was just 8% of GDP. If you shift about 100 years later, you see a very different picture. You see that that has been what has been growing, the rent. The rent that goes to the private sector as profit, but is really the value of the commons that's captured privately. And the amount that still was captured, the good kind of tax, the land rent tax, went from 1%, there's the dark red ribbon, to 4%. So there was a little bit of increase in that. But certainly a big increase in taxes on labor and production, from 6% to 28%. And look at what that has caused with the real economy. As a proportion of GDP, the real economy has shrunk from the 85% down to 39%. So in our proposal, and there's lots of examples of it, at least partial implementation we don't have time to go into, but in our proposal and in the ethics of this is that the land rent is socially created value from the gifts of nature. and that land rent belongs to the people as a whole, either to pay for public services or with the citizen dividends, both. And we should untax labor and production. So it works out perfectly because the amount that is now the private land rent is about a third of GDP. Well, the taxes is about a third of GDP in Australia. But look, it would show the returns to the productive economy. It would now be 2/3 would go to the productive economy, and we would still have the tax base for the public sector of 1/3. And there would be no private profiteering and speculation in the gifts of nature. Weakness and flaws in the APF model, just a little more of this. The lack of a holistic green tax shift paradigm accounts, I think, for the weaknesses and flaws in the APF model. The fund is frequently criticized by environmentalists who maintain that distributing dividends sourced from petroleum aligns the people with the interests of those engaged in polluting, non-renewable extractive industries. And there's likely some truth in this. Without a commitment to shifting to renewable forms of energy, Alaskans may end up with higher energy costs and worsened environmental conditions in the future. Utilizing a substantial portion of oil rent to invest in the shift to renewable energy, either developed by the state or via low-interest loans to the private sector, would address this concern, as would the polluter pay green taxes. Now, the big and last I'm going to talk about problem of the APF is the investment fund. It's important to understand that APF dividends are drawn from the interest accruing to the investment of the state's oil revenue. The structure of the APF investment portfolio may well be the most problematic component of the model. The Alaska's Constitution and state law requires for the fund's investments that they only invest in income-producing investments. Therefore, no education of the rest of the world and how you establish these kind of sovereign wealth funds, none of that. The goal of the fund's investments should be to maintain the safety of principal while maximizing total return, the prudent investor rule. Under these common investment rules, there is no established criteria for socially or environmentally responsible investing. Talking to Gary last evening, Norway does have socially responsible investment screening. Alaska should be learning to put that in like Norway's doing, but has not yet. In fact, the fund makes a special point that it minimizes risk and within that constraint maximizes investment yield and does not engage in so-called social or political investing. The fund is now so large, I was going to put that in, but you said it was 46 billion, that it has the power to capture significant amounts of resource rents and other earned income, unearned income, from throughout the world. Here lies the crux of the problem. And it's an oops. It was established to secure common heritage rights to rents. And here's one of the writers on that early on who wrote about the commons, the Alaska Solution, Crisis in the Commons. Walter Hickel, part of the thinking that went behind the Alaska Permanent Fund, not the dividend, but the fund itself. So established to secure the common heritage rights for the people of Alaska, the APF now draws resource rents from territories around the world. The dilemma is, mandated by law to secure the continued prosperity of the citizens of Alaska now into the future, the fund receives substantial payments from land and natural resources worldwide via fund investments in real estate and stocks, as profits from the latter also include substantial amounts of land and resource rent. We stumbled across this from Pennsylvania when we were building a fairly strong movement at the time to shift Philadelphia's tax base to land value tax. And looking at who owns what land and what it's worth in Philadelphia, we came across some landholdings of the Alaska Permanent Fund. So there was a in-our-nose example of how Alaska Permanent Fund investing in real estate in Philadelphia was capturing the resource rent that we wanted to pull into Philadelphia for Philadelphia to take it back to Alaska. But you're going to get that because we don't have the whole paradigm yet. There's little bits and pieces, and what we're doing is seeing how we can put these pieces together, and voila, becomes a very complete and integrated holistic model. But we don't really have that model everywhere yet, but it is emerging. And I think that's part of what we're doing today in the Vermont Common Assets work that Gary's doing. So status quo investing. Although the fund states that it does not engage in social political investing, the fact is that its status quo investment approach does indeed impact the social and political realities of people throughout the world. The APF website tells us that stocks are held in 59 countries and 60 sectors, including oil, gas, coal, and rubber. They're capturing the resource funds from other people and other places. For example, the fund has made substantial investments in ExxonMobil and Chevron. Both companies have major investments in Nigeria, you name it, but any oil-producing countries, they have major investments. A country where most of the people live in dire poverty. Xinhua News Agency reported in 2006 that the company is not abiding by its agreements to hire and maintain indigenous workers. They're not even getting jobs out of it. So regarding the investment climate further in Nigeria, Amnesty International reports 10 years after the internationally condemned executions of the Ogoni 9 in the Niger Delta, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other 8 who were hung for human rights. They were working for human rights for the people and economic human rights, and ecological human rights. The legacy of human rights violations in the Niger Delta continues. Amnesty's report calls particularly attention to the human rights violations and failures of the Nigerian government, Chevron and Shell Oil. Despite video of beatings and independent observer accounts of violence, Chevron has not, nor Shell, lived up to its human rights responsibilities. On the plus side, transparency. Everyone in the world can view the APF investment details, including addresses, maps, and photos on the APF website. All public institutions and corporations should display such a high degree of transparency. The earth is our birthright and ultimately the only rational, supportable, moral, just, and ethical basis upon which the citizens of Alaska can assert a claim to the oil resources of Alaska is by birthright, to the gifts of nature. And that cannot be an exclusive claim. The claim by birthright can only be legitimate if it is acknowledged that all of the human beings have an equal claim to land and natural resources. The deepest ethical dimension of territorial rights recognizes that humanity is one and indivisible in its our fundamental claim to the earth as a birthright of all. For the earth belongs to everyone as a basis for these kinds of funds. New resource rent funds, if they intend to distribute dividends from an investment portfolio, should be based on socially and environmentally responsible investment criteria. Portfolio investment managers can either develop their own protocols or simply place those funds in a socially responsible fund such as Calvert Investments and others. So our criticism of the Alaska Permanent Fund is not meant to distract from the fact that it is very important and the world's only example of a state-owned resource rent or sovereign wealth fund that distributes annual citizen dividends. We have much to learn from both the strengths and the shortcomings of the Alaska Permanent Fund as we work to establish new institutions that collect and fairly share the value of our local to global commons. So, and that's the point. Thank you.
So next I wanted to go into my chapter of this book, which is basically how to export the model to a resource poor state, like Vermont. And I wanted to supply this precautionary principle for reformers. If you want to read it, it's from Machiavelli, which says it's pretty tough to change things because we have enemies in those who profit by the current system and only lukewarm defenders in those who would profit by the new order. I'm sure Chris knows this. As far as sovereign wealth goes, what does Vermont have? We have no oil, no natural gas, no coal, no precious metals, no gemstones, no sun, and not much wind. So what do we have? We have cows and maple syrup. But these are not a part of the commons. These are a little bit different. So I read Capitalism 3.0 by Peter Barnes, and he recommended that we establish a group of common sector trust funds based on the collection of rent from various common assets. And I'll get into a little more detail. So he originated this idea. He started with the Sky Trust, and then he expanded it to creating trust funds. And he felt that a common sector was needed to offset the power of the private sector and the government sector. The government sector often being controlled and manipulated by the private sector. These resources would be put in trust and protected and restored for the benefit of the people, and then users of the commons would pay rent, and this would go into a fund. So this is exactly what the Alaska Permanent Fund does, and this is what we proposed in the Vermont Common Assets Trust Fund. So what is the commons? There's natural and social commons, common assets. It's hard to read, but you know, everything that's part of nature is part of the natural commons. Things that are created by the earth, rocks, metals, oil, seeds, algae, water, rain, etc. So these are all elements of nature. But there's also shared social creations, things created by society, law, democracy, money, trust, roads, streets, sidewalks, etc. These are created by society as a whole, not by any individual effort. And so on the basis of this idea, we proposed this idea of a Vermont Common Assets Trust Fund in 2005, and it was submitted as legislation by Senator Hinda Miller in 2007, more recently by Chris Pearson, who's with us today. The idea is to collect revenue on natural and social assets, protect them for the future, and pay a portion of the fund in dividends to the public. So these are some of the principles. Slightly different than Alaska, it has an environmental protection criteria in there. So the goal of the trustees is not only to protect the fund, but also to protect the resources for the future citizens. So protect certain common assets for the benefit of future generations, establish a framework for collecting fees, deposit the fees into a fund, and manage to protect both the financial and the environmental assets for the future people of the state. And that's how it differs from Alaska. There's no environmental protection component in the Alaska legislation. And just to show you how expansive this is, the Legislative Council, Al Volright, who wrote this, made it extremely expansive. People familiar with ecological economics will recognize he included ecosystem services as part of the commons, like biological diversity, waste absorption, nutrient cycling, etc. And it's a very broad list of things that belong to the public in common. And he also recognized that we've already recognized the atmosphere as a commons in establishing the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which requires utility plants to pay for polluting. Now, what's interesting about Vermont is there are 39 states that collect severance taxes or royalties on the resources. Vermont is one of 11 states that does not collect any severance taxes or royalties or fees on any of its natural resources. And this is why I call Vermont a banana republic. It's basically a resource colony, which is exploited by out-of-state corporations. For example, most of our mining is done by a Swiss corporation. They pay no royalties. All of our hydropower in Vermont is owned by an Ontario corporation, TransCanada, 580 megawatts. Our peak load is 1,000. So they have almost 2/3 of our power capability in one company, and they export all of it out of state. Vermont gets nothing. 2/3 of our electric utilities are owned by a Quebec corporation, Gaz Metro. 32 out of 34 million gallons of groundwater used for bottling are exported by Ice River Springs, an Ontario company, shipped to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, bottled, and then sold back to us for about $6 a gallon in convenience stores. Our surface water, 82% of the surface water extraction in Vermont is used by Entergy to cool their nuclear power plant. And finally, something Vermont has no control over, which is that the federal government has given away for free 98% of the broadcast spectrum to media companies. So some countries are starting to reclaim sovereignty over the resources, such as Ecuador and Bolivia, and we should do the same in Vermont. And when the bill was first submitted in 2007, the legislators came back to me and they said, well, how much is this worth? And so on that basis, we did a study to try to determine how much it's worth. And we looked at natural common assets, air, fish, and wildlife, forests, groundwater, surface water, minerals, and wind. We also looked at socially created value, the internet, the broadcast spectrum, land value, the financial system, and the monetary system. We left out a few things like pharmaceuticals, like something like the 4 most widely sold drugs were funded by government research. but no royalties are paid back to the people. It's all privatized. We didn't include that. So in order to calculate, and I have to admit that our numbers are crude, it's a first attempt, but it gives you sort of a ballpark figure for how much this stuff is worth. In order to do this calculation, you have to understand what is economic rent. And the easiest way I can explain it is if it costs the company all of their expenses, including normal profit, of $20 a barrel, which is not an unreasonable figure, and oil is selling for $147 a barrel, which it was in 2008, then the company is receiving $127 per barrel of unearned income. And that is revenue that should belong to the state, but it's privatized in most cases. It means economic rent is unearned income from asset ownership, it's profit above normal profit, it's after you've subtracted wages, interest, capital, profit, all of the expenses of business, it's everything above that. And it can be collected without any distortions. As I said, Norway collects 78% of the revenue on their oil, and companies are still bidding to get leases. So looking at air, currently companies that emit and people who emit pollution don't pay anything to use the air as a dump. So first thing we need to do, except for the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which only covers utilities, if we expand that to cover both transportation and residential use, there's about 8.4 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And for our low estimate, we took the auction price from the greenhouse gas initiative in 2008, which at the time was $3 a ton. So that's our low end, and that was $26 million. Now on the high end, some people say we should go down to 350 parts per million. In CO2, maybe we need something like $300 a ton to bring that consumption down. Now, and that gave us our high estimate of 2.7 billion. Now, somebody might say that $300 a ton, that's outrageous, oh my God, how could you do that? Well, at $100 a ton is equivalent to about $1 a gallon on gasoline. It's about 100 to 1. So $300 a ton is equivalent to about $3 increase in gasoline. Well, guess what? There's about 10 countries in Europe that have $4 to $5 a gallon on gasoline. So this is actually lower than the existing fuel taxes in Europe. So, and there's a list there of the countries that have over $4 a gallon on gasoline. So this is not an unreasonable figure. And our gas taxes in the United States are very low, about 19 cents in Vermont, plus I think 10 for federal. Okay, next we looked at fish and wildlife, and we came up with a low figure of 10.4 million and a high of 25. We only looked at public forests. We didn't touch private forests. That's a whole area of research. But in public forests, we found that there could be a 10% royalty, which would raise about 3.2 million, and a high of 32 on our high estimate. That one needed a lot more work. Now on groundwater, it was determined by a study in Maine that it costs bottlers about 10 cents per liter. I think it was 10 cents a gallon for bottled water. And they're selling it to us for about $6. So there's something like 88 or 90% profit on bottled water. So we took the economic rent at 70%, and we got a figure of 107.9 million. And if you add groundwater fees to that, you get a high figure of 121.4. So like I said, these are ballpark numbers just to give an idea of how much revenue would be available if we didn't let the bottlers take the water for free and then sell it back to us for double the price of gasoline. Surface water, we looked at all the surface water uses. This is quite interesting. It's very typical in many states for thermoelectric plants to use surface water for cooling. The water comes in the case of Vermont, from the Connecticut River, and the nuclear power plant takes 82% of the surface water extraction in Vermont and uses it for cooling. They pay nothing for use of the water except a small discharge fee. And the legislature actually did increase it by a factor of 10 from about 25,000 to about 250,000 a few years ago after I testified. So they actually did make an effort, but it's still minor compared to the value they're getting for nothing. Not to mention that we voted to shut it down and they're still running. So we ended up looking at all the different sources of uses of surface water, and we came up with $31 million of revenue if they were paying for the use of this water properly. In mining, we looked at a 10% severance tax. Remember, in Alaska, it's 12 to 15% for extraction. The reason that the U.S. hates Hugo Chavez is he raised the royalty rate on oil from 1% to 16%. And many other countries, like Russia now takes 90% of the revenue over $25 a barrel. So there's many other rent regimes that collect much more than this. And then our high was 16 million. As I said, the mining companies, they may pay income taxes, possibly, if they can, but if they're, depending on where their revenue is determined, but if it's outside the state may get nothing from them, but they don't pay any royalties to the state, because Vermont collects no royalties or severance taxes on the resources. And then finally, this was a little bit more sort of speculative, the idea that at some point wind farms are going to produce a huge windfall, and that we may want to charge them for the use of the atmosphere, which is a commons. The wind is definitely something we all share. So should these companies be able to just privatize all that? Maybe there should be a public share at some point in the future. And we got a figure from 3 to 172 million, depending on the state of wind development in the state. As it stands now, the landowner gets a share, the company gets a share, the community or the state gets nothing, quite often. So should just the landowner, the farmer who owns that land, get that wind revenue, or should the state get a cut of that? And that was something we wanted to look at. We definitely did not want to impede the development of the industry, but we thought perhaps in the future there might be some rent possibilities. So that took care of the natural common assets, and then we looked at socially created common assets, of which I include land value, because land value is created by society, not by the owner. It's due to population, public services, business development, and so forth. But the landowner retains the increase. So currently, state property taxes for education are about 1%. And they're collecting about $740 million from the statewide property tax, in addition to local municipal property tax. But if you tax land only at a rate of 5%, you would collect about $1 billion. We subtracted the existing taxes from that in order to say we'd only have an additional $329 million. But if you applied a 10% tax and didn't subtract the existing tax, you would end up with $2.1 billion in revenue. And you might say, oh my God, a 10% land tax, that's so outrageous. Well, it turns out Altoona, Pennsylvania has a 36% land tax. So it's not outrageous to collect that land rent, because the average increase over time of land value is about 5% a year. And from 2000 to 2008, land in Vermont increased by 20% a year, which contributed to the bubble and the bust in real estate. And so if that rent is put into the public purse, you can mitigate the boom-bust cycle, and you can get rid of a lot of speculation, as Alanna pointed out, and generate a lot of revenue. We looked at the internet. Remember, the internet was 100% funded by the public through DARPA, and created for the US military, actually. And a lot of people resist the idea of collecting rent for use of the internet, but guess what? All the internet service providers are charging us for access. Well, why don't they pay us for creating it? So we looked at the sources of revenue, which could be telecoms, internet service providers, and domain names. Now, these are artificial monopolies, and some domains are sold for millions of dollars. So where's our share? So we estimated in Vermont we could generate about $30 million from fees for use of the internet, which is actually currently illegal according to national laws. Now Spectrum, I mentioned that the federal government has given away 98% of the broadcast spectrum, has auctioned off in a one-time auction 2%. John McCain said they used to rob stagecoaches and now they rob spectrum. So we did not calculate the individual value of every broadcast network in the state. We took a national figure and did it per capita. That's the best we could do for now. And you've got something like $375 million a year is the value of the broadcast spectrum. That's radios, telephones, wireless, TV, any kind of broadcast, use of the broadcast spectrum. $375 million a year for that end. And then financial liquidity. Now, Barnes started the working assets? Phone company. And he thought about taking it public. And when he went to an investment bank and to talk to them about going public with this company, he said, well, how much is it going to be worth after you take it public? And they said, well, it's going to be worth 30% more. And he said, well, how come? Well, he said, because the increased liquidity due to all of the financial infrastructure of the stock market, it's going to be worth 30% more. Now that value was created by the public infrastructure. And that's why he calls it a liquidity trust. He did not create that value. Society created that infrastructure, and automatically you take your company public, and on average it's going to increase in value by 30%. Now, Dean Baker, who's an economist, said we should be capturing some of this through speculation taxes. You may have heard of Tobin taxes. All this, 98% of the transactions in the world are speculation. They're not investments. The average stock is held for about 20 seconds. The average foreign currency is held for 30 seconds. Now those are not investments, that's gambling. So Baker did an estimate in 2000, which gave us a figure of about 269 million in Vermont, and he redid the numbers in 2009, and he got a much higher number, and so we got about 743 million. That's with 1/4% speculation tax. Think about it, 1/4% on speculation would generate $740 million in the state, and about, I think it was about 350 billion in the United States. And then finally, the monetary system, which has been completely privatized. People don't realize banks produce over 90% of the money supply through loans. It's not the Federal Reserve, even though they're printing $1 trillion a year. Most of it is being created by banks who collect the interest. And so until such time, now we should have public money. Banks should not be able to create money. There should be 100% reserve requirements. But until that time, we said, all right, fine. We don't have public money yet. So in the meantime, they should pay us 1% of their loans. And we threw that into the mix. And if you add it all up, you get on the low end. And if you distribute this per capita in Vermont to all 600,000+ people in the state, the per capita dividend on the low end is about $1,900 per year. And on the high end, mainly due to the carbon tax and the land tax, the high end you get about $10,000 per year. So the $1,900 is similar to the Alaska level, family of 4, that's $8,000. The 10,000 figure, is a huge number, but it's within the realm of possibility. I don't claim these are the final word on the subject. These are crude estimates, but they give you an idea of the ballpark sort of ballpark estimates of what kind of numbers could be generated if we actually got serious about collecting rent for the use of our natural and social assets, which I think is preferable to taxing our wages and income and our production and our efforts. And most of this value is privatized. This is how the 1% gets their wealth. They privatize the commons, and then they convince government not to tax them on it. And that's how they're able to accumulate all this wealth, all this unearned income. Plus the financial system, which they control, which is now 40% of the economy. And so 1/4% on financial transactions is not very much. But it would start to undo that that stranglehold that the financial system has over the government. And finally, my favorite cartoon on the topic, I'll just leave you with that. It's the only way to get out of this bind where we have to constantly create new jobs, constantly expand the economy to provide work for everyone, is with some kind of a basic income. And we advocate that it be based on what we share in common rather than on personal income.
So I'm Chris Pearson. I'm a state rep. I actually represent a section of Burlington that includes campus where we're standing right now, and I'm in my 4th term. And I'm a progressive. We're one of the, as Gary said, we're the only state in the country with an organized, consistently elected third party. We've been sending people to Montpelier for over 20 years now. We have 5 of us in the House out of 150 and 3 in the Senate out of 30. So, you know, we're not overwhelming them in numbers, but we have, I would say, quite a lot of influence, more influence than perhaps the numbers would suggest we do. And so I wrote at the top of my notes the politics of change, and I like the quote you had, the Machiavellian quote. How do you change? The debate is an enormously challenging question, and one that we're not going to come to a single answer about. But one of the ways is by introducing new ideas, and so I was approached about the Common Assets Bill, and happy to sponsor that. And it did generate a little bit of a discussion, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm also co-chair of the Climate Caucus as another way to try to create change. I looked around the room of 150 House members where I serve, about 100, well, less than 50 of them are Republicans. So the rest are Democrats, progressives, and independents. And I was sort of looking around the room. You need 76 votes to pass something, and I was trying to think of how many people believed in global warming and believed in it as something that was humanity's created. And I kind of concluded that it was most of us. And we weren't having a big discussion about that. And so, along with a Democrat from Norwich, Margaret Cheney, we created the Climate Caucus, and it was trying to kind of look at we've talked today about the comprehensive strategy and an overall holistic discussion. We have an Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and they do some good things, and they've been helping us, particularly on electricity and some natural resource management in the state. But we have separately an Ag Committee, and separately a Tax Committee, and an Education Committee, and a Commerce Committee, and we tend to be in a sort of siloed frame of mind. And so people on the Transportation Committee don't think about global warming very much. Well, that's pretty stupid. So we created the Climate Caucus as a way to bring those interests of people together. And just as an example, it's been somewhat successful, I would say. We've had numerous guests come in and tell us what we should be doing. You know, we're not all experts, and Gary was one of our first, and Gary had a great example that stuck with me was when Germany was increasing its carbon tax, it offset the revenue by dropping the payroll tax. And so it was revenue, in fact, it was revenue negative. So taxpayers got more money in their pocket, got to keep more money in their pocket. And I think that's a really important model as we talk about that, these kinds of ideas. You know, any of the earnest, the worthwhile goals that we could talk about coming out of a carbon tax or a carbon assets fund, a lot of people would agree with until they have to pay the bill. And they simply have no room, no capacity to pay more in taxes, no matter how much they should. So I think that is really important. But just to give you an idea of what we're up against, one of the things that came out of the Climate Caucus discussion was this idea of idling, okay, small potatoes. This year we passed a law, it's now going to be against the law for you to idle your car needlessly, so more than 5 minutes. And that will go into effect in a little less than a year, and it's not going to have people writing tickets if you're violating, but it will be part of driver's ed. There will be sort of educational component of signs. We have that here in Burlington. This is what we're fighting for, and we had to fight tooth and nail to maintain that. In the end, it was almost thrown out by the Senate, and we went round and round and round, and it was actually the folks working, I think it was the Cancer Society, said this is important. This is important for lungs and asthma and things like that. And so we were able to get it in there. But one of the champions and I were talking about it afterwards and kind of lamenting how pathetic that is. we're left to struggle and fight like hell for the crops. And meanwhile, the world is warming. We passed 400 parts per million in our atmosphere, and that's kind of a depressing reality. And so how do you make the political structure change to recognize the reality that scientists are acknowledging in greater and greater numbers? And when there's so much money at stake, and both from the profit sector, as one of Gary's slides pointed out, and then if we are to look at sort of the true costs of energy and pollution, that's a lot of money coming out of working people who are driving to work in a rural state like Vermont. And you know, when you have such an enormous wealth inequality in our country, how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you deal with that? It's an excellent example, as I mentioned, from Germany, to increase the carbon tax, reduce the payroll tax, but they already have a very robust public transportation infrastructure. We don't have that. And so how do you deal with that? And part of changing the debate and changing the discussion and changing what's politically possible in Montpelier is recognizing these pieces of the reality. Some of the little other success stories that I think is worth acknowledging. In Vermont a few years ago, we did pass a bill that recognizes groundwater as part of the common trust. Now there's big loopholes in there because nothing happens in Montpelier that hurts farmers. The farmers use a lot of water. And in the loopholes we created to make sure that farmers weren't paying a bigger tax for water irrigating their fields, we kind of created loopholes that other people drive their semis full of potable water down to Massachusetts. One of the things that, so a couple years ago I introduced the Common Assets bill, and part of that actually trickled up and has been part of more ongoing discussion was the groundwater and bottling extraction idea. It is deeply offensive to most of us that somebody turns a spigot on and fills trucks that go down our roads to Massachusetts where I mean, it creates one job or two jobs for somebody monitoring. It's a tiny, tiny operation. And we proposed, what was it, Gary, 26 cents a gallon. And the guy said, well, that will close my business. I sell it for 1 cent a gallon. And we're saying, well, geez, that's a bad deal for you. For you as a business, since they're selling it for $6 a gallon, you're selling it to them for a penny a gallon, and it's a bad deal for Vermonters. And you know, somewhere in there is where we're discussing. You know, does it probably not going to be 26 cents a gallon tax? And you know, for somebody like me, frankly, it doesn't bother me if that business shuts down. I think our water would be better left in the common trust underground. Most legislators don't take quite that approach, but there is still a certain sense of outrage that our water is just going up, getting on trucks and going to Massachusetts. If we were bottling it here, we would have a little bit of a different discussion. At least those would be jobs. To me, it would maybe change my motivation quite the same way. But that has been a discussion that was circulating around, and in particular, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, the tax committee over there, had that gentleman in, the guy who owns that. And he said, what, are you out of your mind? You're squeezing me out of business if you do this. We also were about to pass a sales tax on bottled water, kind of recognizing some of the leadership here at UVM that said, we don't actually need bottled water. We all have perfectly potable water coming out of our faucets everywhere across the state. And so, you know, even Republicans supporting the idea of a sales tax on bottled water, which is exempt. That didn't end, that ended up coming out of the bill at the very end because actually we didn't have a bill. That's part of the larger political discussion. One of the other lessons as the Climate Caucus has dug into some of these issues is around renewable energy in particular. I think it throws into this conversation. In Germany, you see again in Germany model in many ways for this stuff, a just blossoming of renewable energy around the country and in all parts of the country. And one of the ways, when you dig in, one of the ways they do that is that you don't have big privately owned corporations coming in and buying a little chunk of land and putting up windmills, or buying buying access to public lands, put up windmills or solar farms. You see small businesses come together around a community sense of ownership. And so it's not, I can't believe these guys have windmills on our mountains. It's, hey, look at our windmills. That's powering my house. Watch this. Poof. Turn on the light, and my windmill is turning on my lights. And that, I see it, the polling for all of the, for if any of you live in Vermont, we have a very heated discussion about wind right now, the ridgeline wind. Polling in the Northeast Kingdom, in the neighborhood where it's supposedly, no politician says they're pro-wind. 2 out of 3 Vermonters support ridgeline wind. So we have a very bizarre debate happening right now. But in fact, I believe the solution is not to turn it over to corporate entities, for-profit entities, but for us to all of it, and to recognize the unity and a shared vision for, we need to figure out this solution. So it's an enormous road ahead, and one of the things I ask myself almost daily, I carry this little sort of, looks like a silver dollar, it's a pewter globe that my wife gave me when I was first elected, and it just, I try to remind myself what I'm doing about failure. I should probably make 150 of these and hand them out. Maybe you can remind my colleagues. But how do you do this? How do we do this? How do you do it in a time when a whole lot of Vermonters are struggling just to figure out the world we live in today and provide food for their kids and pay for their energy costs and their home heat and all that? How do we radically change the discussion and in a way to get that family, those families who are a great majority of our state, to say, I know that's a big struggle. And don't forget about this struggle, that if you're not feeling it today, we're certainly all going to feel it within a generation. And by the way, we'd also like to provide for quality of living for you and your family. I mean, you look at higher education, out of reach for most Vermonters. Average median household income, half of Vermonters are $53,000 or less. So that's the middle road. So there's not a lot of families, being able to buy a hybrid when your whole house is under $50,000. I mean, that's just the reality. And of course, a hybrid is not really a solution for much. But that's kind of where our discussion is at. And I welcome ideas, and our panel, offers some of them. Alaska offers some examples, but we are not a resource-producing state by and large. And even the Alaska solution, I like the common sense of things, but I think I was reading somewhere it does produce everyone's for drilling in Alaska. So you're not really getting in touch with climate change as a solution. But surely there are models there in community ownership, in public participation, and how do we do it. We've had just a couple other ideas of I think, small successes. Something that I helped promote, and other people have promoted it, and it's one of the roles the legislator plays. Most of us take credit for things, but we have to acknowledge we don't actually come up with many ideas ourselves. It was an energy competition. Right now there are schools across Vermont who are competing to see who can save the most energy. And I wanted to see it as towns. Could Burlington get a community spirit going to reduce our energy consumption per capita more than Winooski or Barrie or Essex? And could there be prizes? The winning community gets a solar array for one of their river schools, something like that. Because we are in this together. And we tend to think of it as, I bought I have compact fluorescents, and I have an efficient fridge, and we only have one car, and I bicycle everywhere. And we're missing something without having a real sense of community ownership of the problem. And before we have that, it's very, very challenging for those of us who come together who are trying to change the paradigm in what has to be considered one of the most progressive states in the country, which is a somewhat bleak outlook. But there are good signals, there are good signs, and there are good examples of things that are positive and happening. I worry that it's not enough of them not fast enough. So I hope that helps. I hope that's more or less what, I can answer your question. That's what I got.
Thank you.
Thank you.